Good afternoon. Welcome to the Living Word Speaker Series. My name is Sarah Barron. I'm the Dean of the Library, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of everyone in the library and at Regent University to this event. I'm here today to introduce Dr. Kevin Spahn, and Dr. Spahn is Associate Professor of Old Testament in our School of Divinity here at Regent. He has his doctorate from the University of Oxford, a master's from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and a bachelor's from Gordon College. His most recent publication is a co-edited volume titled Spirit and Scripture, Exploring a Pneumatic Hermeneutic. Today, Dr. Spahn is going to speak to us on the topic Psalm 151 in 11 Q Psalms and the Septuagint. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Spahn.
Welcome, everybody. It's a delight to have this chance to share a little history with you and deal with some texts. I got a story to tell you today about Psalm 151. It's a story with some twists in the plot. I'm tried to keep the technical stuff to a minimum, but we are dealing with ancient texts, and it gives a wonderful light into the sort of history of ancient religious texts that come out of ancient Judaism. So the title, Psalm 151 in the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls. LXX, which is an acronym for the Septuagint, LXX Psalm 151 and 11Q Psalm 151. The history of Psalm 151 is a noteworthy example of the transmission of text in ancient Judaism. Two text forms of Psalm 151 have been preserved in history. The Septuagint Psalm 151 was composed in Greek and concludes the Greek Psalter of the Septuagint, which is the oldest translation of the Hebrew Bible. 11Q Psalm 151 was written in Hebrew and similarly concludes the great scroll of Psalms in the 11th cave of the Qumran community. This scroll is a collection of 8 apocryphal psalms discovered in the 11th cave of the Qumran community on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Since the Hebrew text form of Psalm 151 is about 20% longer than the Greek text form of Psalm 151, a debate among scholars persists regarding which textual tradition is more original than the other. Part of the contributions of this study of these texts is that both the Hebrew and Greek text forms were preserved among some of the same repositories as the related canonical manuscripts. And conceptually, Psalm 151 and its examination offers us another glimpse into the messianic beliefs of Second Temple Judaism. Now, did that advance? Fine. To set the stage for our exploration into the reception, history, and transmission of Psalm 151 in ancient Judaism, we will first treat some key introductory concepts of our discussion of these two text forms. After a description of Septuagint Psalm 151 and 11Q Psalm 151, we will be ready to consider selected issues of a scholarly debate regarding the priority of this psalm. Now into introductory concepts. The phrases Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, they're all 3 phrases used generally by different communities to refer to the exact same piece of literature. Yeah, it's rearranged for some communities, but it's the same literature. 3 names refer to the same body of literature. The critical edition of the Hebrew Bible used today by contemporary scholars is based upon Leningrad Codex 19a, a written book, a medieval written book, not a scroll, which is the oldest complete codex of the Hebrew Bible. This codex preserves the Masoretic text in the Tiberian tradition by scribes of the Ben Asher family and is dated to about 1010 of the Common Era, or the 11th century. The Aleppo Codex is another extremely important codex from this Masoretic era. However, large amounts of Torah and other parts of the Hebrew Bible are missing from it. But these 2 codices preserve the received consonantal text and tradition of the Hebrew Bible, as well as the development of the writing systems to record the vowels and the accents of the Tiberian school. It is important to note that there is a scholarly consensus that this consonantal text of the Masoretic tradition was largely in place long before the 11th century. However, the determination of the age of its consonantal text is still debated by scholars between 600 and 1,000 years before Codex Leningrad, or to about the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. No authority less than Emmanuel Tove would see it reaching back, the consonantal text of the Masoretic tradition, reaching back to the 1st century of the Common Era. This textual tradition is merely the starting point for contemporary scholars because Codex Leningrad 19 can be profitably studied against older Hebrew manuscripts and epigraphic evidence, as well as the testimony of older ancient versions, the most important of which is the Greek Septuagint, but you also have the Aramaic Targumim, you have the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Syriac Peshitta, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and other later collections and versions. Now, I've already talked a little about history, and I've got a timeline. It's not a highly sophisticated timeline, but it's a timeline. And I intend these two to run parallel. Here we are in the 21st century, down in the right-hand corner, and I have the major areas of the New Testament and the Old Testament on the prior line above. And I'm trying to situate historically where the Hebrew codices of the Masoretic tradition come from, the 11th century, and there are three great Septuagint codices that I have a few comments to make about. This timeline is an incredible simplification of a very complex history of texts and versions. This refers only to the codices of the Common Era and not to the many manuscripts of parts of the Hebrew Bible. The three great codices of the Septuagint, also from the 4th and 5th century of the Common Era. As with the Leningrad and Aleppo codices, these Septuagint sources have older, more fragmentary evidence which could not possibly be listed on this timeline or any timeline. Even though each stage of the reception of an ancient document can be studied profitably by scholars, the salient goals of text critics include the reconstruction of one or more stages of the pre-Masoretic text, that is, the consonantal framework of the Second Temple period. Depending on whether the goal is to reconstruct, one, the earliest inferable text, or two, the Hebrew source of the Septuagint translation in Alexandria of Egypt that started in the 3rd century BCE, before the Common Era, or one of the stages of the history of the redaction of selected biblical books, like, if you think about it, the book of Psalms, which contains psalms from virtually every historical era of ancient Israel, and yet in the course of time, each of those psalms makes their way into what we now call the Psalter. But there's a long history in bringing that to bear. So there are many pre-Masoretic texts that scholars can focus upon in their reconstruction of their work. But now as we transition to the Septuagint, after the spread of the Hellenistic culture following the conquest of Alexander the Great, the Jewish diaspora community in Alexandria of Egypt in the 3rd century BCE needed their Hebrew and Aramaic biblical traditions to be translated into their vernacular, which was Greek. The needs of the diaspora community were the chief impetus in the translation of the Hebrew Bible into the Septuagint. However, the letter of Aristeas suggests that Ptolemy II also sanctioned this translation project. Of course, much later, the New Testament apostles come on the scene, and in their description of an understanding of the work and the person of Christ, they cite and otherwise refer to these Septuagint traditions as they write the New Testament manuscripts. Consequently, In addition to the consonantal texts of the Hebrew codices dated between the 1st and 5th century of the Common Era, the Greek codices of the Septuagint and related fragmentary evidence point indirectly to another related but distinguishable textual tradition of the Hebrew Bible from a different geographical region in Alexandria between the 3rd and at least the 1st century BCE. By studying the 3 great codices of the Septuagint, the Hebrew textual tradition that was the source of these Septuagint traditions is indirect evidence of a pre-Masoretic Hebrew text, again, in and from Alexandria. Back to the timeline. So in general, the 2 attestations of Psalm 151 that we're going to look at come from the Second Temple period. You can see the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls there listed on the rather crude timeline. The Qumran community stored, copied, and produced texts. They also received texts from other areas outside of the community, so its repository of evidence is not a monolithic collection. With that sort of foundation laid, we now turn our attention to some of the details of these 2 text forms. First, again, working with 11Q Psalm 151, this is the mouth and the exterior of Cave 11 of the Qumran community. In this cave was 11Q Psalm, the great Psalm scroll that we are going to open together and read one psalm. That is 11Q Psalm. Quite a remarkable picture if you think about it. 11Q Psalm is a collection of 8 extra-canonical psalms, the last of which is the one that we're going to look at today, which differs from the deuterocanonical Psalm 151 of the Septuagint. Be careful. Don't compare what you see with a Torah scroll you may have seen in a synagogue or in some documentary. The ruler there is a ruler marking centimeters. 11Q Psalm, if it was stood on end, would be about that tall. Okay? So it's nowhere, you see the big parading of the Torah scroll is a wonderful celebration, but that is not the size of 11Q Psalm. There you have the psalm. This is the 28th column of 28 columns that comprise 11Q Psalm. And beginning on the 3rd line is the psalm that we're going to look at, 11Q Psalm 151. Again, you read Hebrew from right to left, right? So when you get to the end of a work, if there's a leftover page, it'll be the page on the left. Due to damage at the bottom, the last 2 lines, that's lines 13 and 14 of the 28th column, have been only partially preserved. So now we transition from introductory concepts to an actual description of these 2 text forms we have before us. And again, now we're looking at the Greek Psalter and we're looking at 11Q Psalm, the scroll that you just saw. The origin of the 2 text forms of Psalm 151 is in general, at least this is our starting point, the Second Temple period. Gabby's helped distribute a handout. I hope there have been enough to go around. And now let's take a little time and let's just look at what the contents and how they compare. And if you need one, please make it known to Gabby in the back. Let's start with Septuagint Psalm 151. LX Septuagint Psalm 151 is attested to in all 3 of the great codices of the Septuagint from the 4th to 5th centuries of the Common Era. After the title, the superscription of this psalm, It consists of 7 verses. It is an example of the genre of rewritten Bible. It is based on 1 Samuel chapter 16 to 17, and it is an apocryphal psalm of David of the Second Temple period. The psalm consists of 2 sections, the first of which is framed in verses 1 to 5 by the phrase, Hoi adelphos mu, my brothers. This inclusio delineates the beginning and the ending of a subunit in this overall piece of literature. These first 5 verses concern the unexpected rise of David from the obscurity of being a shepherd and being the youngest of his apparently better qualified and better looking, it says, brothers. The reason for his ascendancy is not attributed to anything observable to the eye, but to the all-seeing God who takes delight in David. Join me right after the title. On the left-hand column, Septuagint Psalm 151 reads, I was small among my brothers, the youngest in the house of my father. I tended the sheep of my father. My hands made musical instrument. My fingers tuned a harp. But who will report this to my Lord? The Lord himself. He is the one who listens. It was he who sent his messenger and took me from the sheep of my father and set me apart with his anointing oil. My brothers were handsome and tall, but the Lord did not delight in them. The second part of the psalm consists of the final 2 verses, which recount how deliverance from the idol worshiper came from God's unexpected elevation of David as Israel's deliverer from this pagan. Verse 6. I went out to meet the foreigner. He cursed me by his idols. But as for me, having drawn the sword from him, I beheaded him and removed the reproach from the children of Israel. Now please consider the title of Psalm 151 in the Greek tradition. Many of the titles of the individual psalms in the Greek Psalter tend to be much longer than those in the Hebrew Psalter. Consequently, it is absolutely no surprise to the reader of the Greek Psalter that LXX Psalm 151 also has a relatively long title, which reads, This psalm was written with David's own hand, even though it is outside the number, after he fought Goliath in single combat. 3 observations seem noteworthy at this point. First, in the title, the attribution of Davidic authorship to apocryphal psalms is well attested in the Second Temple period. The emphasis placed upon this feature in the Greek tradition of Psalm 151, however, is without parallel. This psalm was written from David's own hand. Second, by employing the phrase, quote, outside of the number, the author evidently recognized Septuagint Psalm 151 as a supplement to the collection of 150 psalms of the Greek Psalter after the translation of the Hebrew Psalter to Greek was fully completed. Third, the final temporal clause of this title unifies the second part and the first part of this psalm that we've read, which becomes important because of one particular debate that arises among scholars when it comes to those final 2 verses. We may have time to get into that debate, we may not, but if we do, at least I've laid a foundation. Now let's consider the right-hand column, 11Q Psalm 151. Unlike the Greek text form of Psalm 151, 11Q Psalm 151 is written in Hebrew. As with the history of any language, the Hebrew language underwent development throughout its use in the biblical period and into the post-biblical era as well. Consequently, scholars date evidence in part by the characteristic features of each era of the Hebrew language. So scholars talk about standard biblical Hebrew, late biblical Hebrew, rabbinic, Mishnaic forms of Hebrew, and various forms of medieval Hebrew, and of course, on and on it goes. Consequently, the dating of the Hebrew in 11Q Psalm 151 receives considerable attention in scholarship. So let's just give an overview of our psalm here. You can see, first off, that several lines of the Hebrew text form of 151 share the same general conceptual content that is in the Septuagint. In other words, like in the Septuagint, verse 1 is talking about his relative size to his brothers and his age relative to his brothers, and that 1c, that he is shepherding a flock and he's ruler over his little goats. Like similarly in verse 2, it talks about the crafting of an instrument and the playing of a musical instrument. But then you move to line C of verse 2, or verse 2c, and if you look over in your left-hand column, you have what are called minuses in the Septuagint. Notice I'm not calling them expansions in the Hebrew psalm, because in order to call them expansions, I'd have to know which psalm came first. Herein lies one of the greatest debates surrounding Psalm 151. But nevertheless, let's look at the unique material in the Hebrew tradition. And so I offered glory to the Lord. I said to myself, the mountains do not witness to him, nor do the hills proclaim. The trees have cherished my words, and the flock my deeds. Then continuing on to 4, you have a question, just like you do in the Septuagint. You similarly have a reference to the Lord of all, the God of all. Moving on in this, an interesting thing happens in verse 5 of 11Q Psalm 151. Again, it shares the fact that he had been distinguished by a messenger and anointed, but 11Q Psalm 151 states that it was Samuel that made him great. And then, interestingly, what is verse 4b and c in the Septuagint, it is an 11Q Psalm 151, but it's been rearranged. And that's that rather ugly arrow pointing to the rearrangement that does occur in 11Q Psalm 151, but it's at verse 7, not the corresponding place in the Septuagint. And you'll notice that the end of verse 5 of the Hebrew text form again picks up with the same sharing of language and concepts, really, of the Septuagint. My brothers went out to meet him, handsome of figure and appearance. Although they were tall of stature and handsome because of their hair. Interesting. The Lord did not choose them, but he sent and took me from behind the flock and anointed me with the holy oil. And he made me leader of his people and ruler over the children of the covenant. At the beginning of David's power, after God's prophet had anointed him, then I saw a Philistine shouting insults from the ranks of the enemy. And then with the end, with the partial preservation of line 13 and 14, that is the conclusion of the Hebrew text form of Psalm 151. So you see conceptual bowering, you see minuses in the Septuagint, you see a rearranged passage. So now we move further and have just a very brief conversation about the priority of Psalm 151, which is to say, what came first? The chicken or the egg? That's really what this discussion is. What came first? The Greek text form or the Hebrew text form? Do you understand? By assuming or deciding on which text form comes first, you end up characterizing the other as either an expansion or an abridgment, right? For if the longer Hebrew text form was first, and from it came the Greek text form, then the scribe responsible for the Greek text form abridged the longer version. Conversely, and actually we're not talking about there being a direct relationship between these two between these two psalms, but they are part of a textual tradition that obviously have some relationship, but it's not a clear relationship unless you, well, it's still debated among scholars. So is the longer Hebrew text tradition an expansion of a shorter, earlier Greek Psalm 151, or is the shorter textual tradition of the Greek Psalm 151 an abridgment of an originally longer textual tradition reflected in 11Q Psalm 151? I want to just briefly touch both sides of the debate, and you can decide for yourself. Oh, that's a new Hebrew font I've not seen before. That's what you get for using a computer to project something you haven't done before. You never know what's going to happen to the Hebrew. James A. Sanders, who was the editor of the first publication of the Psalms from Cave 11 in 1965, I'm pretty sure about that, assumed that 11Q Psalm 151 was the original psalm. In following years, Ari Hurwitz solidified this consensus view for the first generation of scholarship of the Dead Sea Scrolls by arguing that 11Q Psalm 151 contains late biblical Hebrew, specifically of the Persian era, which means basically between, it'd be the early part of the Persian era, so that would be sometime between, generally, Haggai and Zechariah and the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, that maybe 70, 80-year period, according to Ari Hurwitz. The evidence in support of this original consensus is as follows. And I'm just not going to, I'm going to have to describe it. These are some of the chief examples. But the chief thing that Ari Hurwitz is getting at here has to do with the distinctive style of late biblical Hebrew of word order, okay? Of the preference for finite verbs, which later in the post-biblical period, there becomes a preference for participles. And when you're using a participle in Hebrew, the default word order would be it to be preceded by an independent pronoun. See, I'm pressing, I got too technical, and I'm losing you, so come, steady on. But I'm trying to be kind, okay? But for instance, I'll just do this one, this amarti ani benafshi, this I said to myself. It does look like good biblical Hebrew. You've got the initial verb, you have, it's not necessarily required, but you do have an independent personal pronoun in ani. And if that was late biblical Hebrew, that would tend to be first, and you wouldn't have a finite verb, and you'd have a participle. And there's, again, a lot of things to press into, some observations about direct object markers, which you can see in C. That second Hebrew term is just a good old direct object marker. So enough said about that. The conclusion of the initial generation was that 11Q Psalm 151 was a product of the earliest part of the Second Temple period, and that the Septuagint work, which we know comes from Alexandria and didn't start until, it's debated, but we'll just say broadly 3rd century BCE, 250, maybe a little earlier. This was the original consensus of the first generation of Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship. And I must say, Ari Hurwitz, I just got an email, was it yesterday or the day before? He just passed away, so my regards to him. Moving to the alternative thesis that is emerging, that is taking the opposing view, that is not 11Q Psalm 151, but Septuagint Psalm 151 is the more original of the two. Again, the textual traditions that it represents is more original than the Hebrew tradition. This is an emerging alternative. It is still debated to this day. It has to do with the basic point of this alternative view is that the situation is much more difficult, much more entailed than just simply finding some biblical Hebrew phrases in it. The point is, the fundamental point of the alternative emerging view is that 11Q Psalm 151 does not use biblical Hebrew throughout. There's other forms of Hebrew in it. An emerging alternative theory that regards the Greek text form of Psalm 151 as prior to 11Q Psalm 151. This alternative theory does not deny the use of late biblical Hebrew in the Hebrew text form that is so foundational to the original consensus. This emerging view simply contends that there is much more to the story. Just going to give you a few examples. Point A. In verse 1, you can see it on your paper, verse 1a and b, there is a word pairing. It's poetry. They're done in parallel. And that is brother is in parallel to the sons of the father. And it's there right on the overhead. According to Haran and Kasuto, and they're correct because this is an observable fact, such a word pairing does not occur in the Hebrew Bible. It is not characteristic of it. What is characteristic of the Hebrew Bible is listed as brothers and sons of the mother, and there is an example of some of that evidence. Okay? So it's uncharacteristic word pairing in verses 1, B, or A and B. Over against what happens in 11Q Psalm verse 1 of 151, look at what happens in the Septuagint Psalm 151 at verse 1. It has a word pairing that is characteristic of biblical Hebrew. That is a word pairing of my brothers and the house of my father. In the Greek text form at verse 1 is a fixed word pairing in biblical literature, and there are some of the examples. Consequently, Septuagint Psalm 151 verse 1b fits biblical Hebrew better than 11Q Psalm 151b. Third point. 11Q Psalm, according to Menachem Haran, employs forced artificial biblical Hebrew. A very interesting example here. Look at verse 1c of the Greek text form. It reads, when he made me shepherd, roeh, very good Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, of his flock, and ruler, moshel, over his little goats. The point here has to do with this, with the phrase or the term, the participle, moshel, ruler. The verb mashal in Hebrew means to rule, in the sense that that Pharaoh ruled Egypt, or in the sense that the Lord ruled Israel, or even in the sense that a person can rule or control their temper sometimes. But not to describe the activity of a shepherd. Never. It's actually it sort of sticks out. The work of a shepherd in the Hebrew Bible, either roeh, I've got both spellings there, roeh. The work of a shepherd, roeh, in the Hebrew Bible is marked by the cognate verb. You can see you should take Hebrew, but you don't need to see this point. You can see that the noun uses the same consonants, okay, the verb uses the same consonant as the noun. There's a cognate relationship to them, but never mashal, okay? So as a reader, you begin, that's strange. Well, let's look at least one more piece of evidence. And it has to do with, oh my goodness, something happened to my font. But again, the point here, very simply, this is in verse 7c, has to do with after God's prophet had anointed him, this one that entire phrase, once you take Hebrew, you'll learn is one form in Hebrew, okay? And it includes a finite verb with a prefix on it, which is just mem shin, which I try to underline, and this has been, well, you can see it down here in the left-hand corner, the prefix mem shin, after. There's nothing like that in biblical Hebrew. It is highly consistent and unique to rabbinic Hebrew. Much later, okay? According to this second theory, the use of late biblical Hebrew in this psalm is most plausibly explained. Oh, before I go to that conclusion, I just one more sentence. With these two word pairings, and particularly the use of mashal and this rabbinic prefix, when you're in this material and you encounter that and you consider it as biblical Hebrew, it's kind of like reading a biography of Ben Franklin, which claims that on his way to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, his mode of transportation was a Mercedes. It's just, wait, that's anachronistic. It doesn't fit. It's like saying Ben Franklin was on the moon. Again, there's this striking difference that this alternative theory tries to explain. What we call when a scribe is using an older style of language, perhaps maybe to make his writing look older, it's called archaizing Hebrew, okay? This alternative, this emerging theory in basically it identifies, agrees that there are attempts at archaizing Hebrew that were successful, but they weren't all successful. Point B, the selected, and I've only chosen selected examples, selected unsuccessful attempts betray the relative lateness of 11Q, the relative lateness of the textual traditions of 11Q Psalm 151 to the prior textual traditions of Septuagint Psalm 151. Another interesting thing happens. Look at your sheet. If you remove all of what now I will call the additions of 11Q Psalm, what is left? What is left is the essence of Septuagint Psalm 151 with one rearrangement. Okay, it's still debated. And if the emerging alternative theory is true, then 11Q Psalm 151 is expansive, and Septuagint Psalm 151 is not an abridgment of a previous Hebrew text form in the tradition of 11Q Psalm. And in closing, I just would like to just say a word about the role of Psalm 151 that Psalm 151 may have played in post-biblical Judaism. After generations of living under the oppression of Gentile hegemony, the account of the sudden ascendancy of adolescent David as the anointed victor over an arch nemesis and idol worshiper became a compelling messianic motif in the Second Temple period. While no explicit reference is made to Psalm 151 in the New Testament, complementary portraits of David in the Hebrew Bible, for example, Psalm 2, were cited by the leaders of the earliest church as expressions of their messianic beliefs. The supplementation of Psalm 151 to the Greek Psalter, which corresponds to its the final placement of 11Q Psalm in the Great Scroll from Cave 11, also suggests that this psalm offered a credible expression of messianism under Rome in the late Second Temple period. Why would a relatively late scribe be moved to take up the story of David's unexpected ascendancy as the deliverer of Israel by using the story of 1 Samuel 16 to 17? One plausible explanation is to appreciate the centuries of Gentile oppression over Israel and the Jewish aspirations to be delivered from this oppression similarly, suddenly, thoroughly. Who better than David? The obscure shepherd whom God raised to suddenly deliver Israel from the threat of the Philistines seems like a reasonable choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Spahn. We're going to have questions and answers in just a minute, so if you have some questions for Dr. Spahn, please get them ready. In the meantime, I wanted to remind you that the Living Word exhibition of biblical artifacts is continuing just across the atrium today until 6:30. It will be open tomorrow from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m., on Friday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., and on Saturday from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. I also want to welcome all of our guests, people who may not be from campus. This might be your first visit. Welcome. We also want to give a shout out to Dr. Becker's Psalms class. Thank you for coming. And when you go to the exhibit, there is a little evaluation form. We'd love for you to fill that out. Tell us what you have enjoyed, and give us some feedback on the exhibit. So now we will have Q&A for Dr. Spahn. Any questions? Come on. Yes, we do have one question.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very good question. I'm not going to be so presumptuous to have an answer to it. I think I find it compelling. It's just a thought, not arguing this per se. But that's the suddenness of the ascendancy of David, and it reflects perhaps sits in Laban a context of desperation. Some scholars press the context for this psalm much more specifically, some to the Maccabean period, some to the Hasmonean period when patriotism was on the rise and the look for a champion like David. So there, it's a very good question. But I would say, just consider what is the impact of supplementing Septuagint Psalm 151 after the completion of the Hebrew translation of canonical, whatever. That's talk about anachronism. That they wouldn't use language like that. But wouldn't that supplementation of 151 to the Greek Psalter heighten the overall messianic reading, perhaps, of the entire Psalter? For now you have a conclusion. Let's talk about I could compare this to the discussions that occur in the scholarship on the Hebrew Psalter. Since 1985, the main question in Psalm studies is, what is the significance of this arrangement of the entire Psalter? In other words, looking at what it has accomplished over the all, taking seriously the 5-book structures, what scholars call seam psalms, strategically positioned psalms at the beginning, an introduction, at the end, a conclusion. And part of the usefulness of a 5-book structure to the Hebrew Psalter is that now you have a strategic place to introduce and conclude every book, and then concentrating particular collections. You have massive Davidic collections in books 1, 2, and 5. And I would suggest there's another interesting position on what the introduction to the book of Psalms is, and increasingly the view is that it's not just Psalm 1, but it's Psalm 1 and 2 together, which heightens not just the proverbial wisdom of Psalm 1, but since Psalm 2 is a coronation royal psalm, it heightens those themes. And sure enough, you've got strategically located royal psalms at the end of Book 2 in 72 and Book 3 in 89. And then you move to the Septuagint, that even becomes further heightened by putting 151 at the end. And those are just some thoughts, definitely not an answer, but a good question. Sure. Not at all. I know I could lose some weight, I know. Thanks for reminding me of that.
I just heard about this, I think, 2 days ago, but it seems interesting
Yeah, well, just to pick up on the last question first, I think there's a variety, to be honest with you. And so this, I think, fits within the range of possibilities when it comes to size. I mean, it is the most extraordinary psalm scroll in the whole Dead Sea Scroll collection. Perhaps second to the great Isaiah scroll, of course, is just an incredible discovery. There's also copper and there's so many wonderful discoveries. But to your first point, from the perspective of global Christianity, there are communities that regard the Greek Psalter as part of at least the Deuterocanonical collection. I'm offering this, and I tried to be careful at the beginning how that this document or the reception and transmission of Psalm 151, such as we can get our hands around. Separate and apart from that, but it only is further underscored. So thank you. Please.
I'm just intrigued by this phrase, written with David's own hand.
Sure.
Is that to differentiate between this and any of the other songs written by David?
Well, the one thing that we see among apocryphal writings are attributions to those historical figures. And in light of the equally distinction of this psalm in the very next phrase, that it is not part of the 150, it is generally deemed to be late. In fact, I know no one who views it otherwise. And that the best explanation is to align it with the observable phenomenon in the Second Temple period of a form of writing that takes up biblical figures and creates literature on them. Whole bodies, vast bodies, First Enoch, the 12 Testaments of the patriarchs. There's just a vast literature, and that this would comport best with that phenomenon. And I don't know anyone who would regard it as historically from David. If I didn't respond well, come back at me.
I mean, you're saying, anonymous is saying that it was written by David.
Say that again?
This phrase, written with David's own hand, is simply saying that it was written by David.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's more consistent with the Second Temple apocryphal, pseudepigraphical style of writing, where there's a vast body of literature of anonymous scribes taking up obscure, and sometimes not obscure, biblical figures and creating a literature pseudepigraphically in their name. We're dealing with the humanities. This isn't an exact science. So in terms of plausibility, at least what I'm describing is reflective of what is in what scholarship is saying on this. Okay? Yes.
With how David is described as coming from obscurity and not having anything in his appearance that people would be drawn to, do you see any kind of connections to like a messianic concept of the Messiah coming out of obscurity, the Messiah not being the one that people would immediately be drawn to, kind of like there's a verse in Isaiah?
Right. That's exactly what I was thinking of, yeah.
Do you see any kind of connections there? Was that in their concept? Do you think people were expecting that?
I think there is such a vast variety of messianic expectations that, and indeed Isaiah offers like the shoot will come out of the stump of Jesse, the idea of a picture of the obscurity of the coming branch, which Jeremiah and Zechariah pick up, but also in the great servant song, chapters 52 to 53, there are adumbrations of these notions as well. Do I think this psalmist is overtly picking up those categories? I mean, I don't. I think it's hard to prove. But could there be a larger currency of these expectations, at least in some areas of society? Sure. But I can't overtly make that connection. But I do see antecedents in the Hebrew Bible to that. Interesting. But see, what we're doing here is we're thinking about the various ranges of expectations, and here is one expression.
Other questions?
Please.
Got one more. You mentioned that this lays in a way of describes the Rabbinic concept of a sudden emergence of a leader to conquer or whatever, whichever period you think it from. But what about a connection to the messianic concept of Kumar itself? Of the scenes, if we go on back, is that maybe a reflection of that battle that they got?
Yeah.
All that.
If the Septuagint psalm is more original, then yeah, in the expansions of 11Q 151, then certainly they are could be developing their own or his own ideas. But if the priority goes otherwise, then you have an abridgment, and so. But no, then it would still be possible for 11Q to be expressions of that. So undeniably, yes. That's right. That's right. Yeah, the possibilities are. Yeah, the possibilities are. I don't know if they're endless, but there are many.
Join me in thanking Dr. Spahn.
Thank you.
If you have enjoyed this session, I invite you back tomorrow at 10 o'clock, at 2 o'clock, and on Friday at 10 o'clock, 11:30, and 2 o'clock. We will have the rest of our speaker series. If you haven't been through the exhibit yet, please go have a look. We have one of those big giant Torah scrolls that Dr. Spahn mentioned, and we also have a little itty-bitty guy that probably looks just like the picture that he showed you today. Thanks, everybody. Have a blessed day.